Stop for a second, because what just happened might affect people who believed they were fully following the law and still could have found themselves on the wrong side of it overnight. Imagine doing everything right. You study your state's rules. You follow every requirement. You stay within the legal boundaries. And then, without warning, a federal court steps in and says that the very law you've been following may not even stand on constitutional ground. That's not just a legal update. That's a shift in the foundation of how rights are interpreted, enforced, and protected. Now here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. And think carefully before you do. Do you believe courts should have the power to overturn state gun laws if they conflict with the Constitution, even if those laws were passed for public safety? Let me know your answer below. I'm genuinely interested in where you stand on this. Now, let's walk through what actually happened, because the details matter more than the headline. At the center of this situation is a California gun law that imposed restrictions on certain aspects of firearm ownership or use. Laws like these are often passed with a stated goal of increasing public safety, reducing violence, and regulating access. California, in particular, has historically taken a more restrictive approach compared to many other states. But here's where things become legally complex. In the United States, states have the authority to create their own laws. However, those laws must still comply with the U.S. Constitution. And when there's a conflict, federal courts step in to decide whether a state law crosses a constitutional line. In this case, a federal court reviewed the California law and found that there may be serious constitutional concerns, particularly under the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment protects the right of individuals to keep and bear arms. But like most constitutional rights, it is not absolute. Courts have long debated where to draw the line between reasonable regulation and unconstitutional restriction. Historically, courts used a balancing approach. They would weigh the government's interest in public safety against the individual's right to bear arms. But that changed significantly after a series of Supreme Court decisions, especially in recent years. One of the most influential shifts came when courts began focusing more heavily on historical tradition. Instead of asking whether a law is useful or effective, courts now often ask whether similar regulations existed at the time the Constitution was written. In my legal analysis, this shift has dramatically changed how gun laws are evaluated. Courts would likely examine whether the type of restriction imposed by California has a clear historical precedent. If it doesn't, the law becomes much harder to justify under this newer framework. And that's exactly where many modern gun laws face challenges. Because the reality is, today's regulations often deal with technologies, circumstances, and social conditions that didn't exist in the 18th century. So when a federal court shuts down or blocks a law like this, it's not necessarily saying the law had bad intentions. It's saying the law may not align with how the Constitution is currently being interpreted. That distinction matters. Supporters of the California law would argue that regulations are necessary to protect communities, reduce crime, and prevent misuse. They often point to data, public safety concerns, and the evolving nature of modern society. And those arguments are not without weight. But critics argue something very different. They believe that once you allow rights to be adjusted based on modern concerns alone, you risk weakening the constitutional protections that are meant to remain stable over time. There is a strong constitutional argument that rights must be interpreted consistently, not flexibly based on shifting policy goals. This creates a tension that courts are constantly trying to resolve. Now let's bring in the federal versus state dynamic, because this is where things become even more important. States like California can pass their own laws, but they cannot override the Constitution. Federal courts act as a check on state power. When a federal court blocks a state law, it's essentially saying this may go beyond what the Constitution allows. That doesn't always mean the law is permanently gone. Sometimes it's paused, sometimes it's sent back for further review, and sometimes it eventually reaches the Supreme Court. And if that happens, the stakes become even higher, because a Supreme Court decision doesn't just affect one state. It can set a precedent for the entire country. That's why cases like this attract so much attention. Now, let's talk about real-world impact. For lawful gun owners, this kind of decision can create confusion. One day a rule is in place, the next day it's challenged or blocked. It becomes harder to know exactly what is allowed and what isn't. And that uncertainty carries legal risk. Even if a law is later overturned, actions taken while it was in effect could still have consequences. That's why it's critical to stay informed and always act within the current legal framework. There is no benefit in guessing or assuming when it comes to compliance. From a practical standpoint, this also affects how people make decisions about ownership, storage, transportation, and usage of firearms. In my legal analysis, one of the biggest challenges is not just the law itself, but how quickly it can change through the court system. Now let's step back and look at the broader implications. What we're seeing is not just a single legal battle. It's part of a larger national conversation about rights, safety, and the role of government. Courts are being asked to define the boundaries of constitutional protections in a modern world that looks very different from the one in which those protections were written. And there are no easy answers. Some believe stronger regulations are necessary. Others believe constitutional rights must remain firmly protected even when it's uncomfortable. Both perspectives exist within the legal system, and both are being tested in real time. Politically, the likelihood of laws like this continuing to be challenged is extremely high. Regardless of which side you're on, this issue is not going away. We are likely to see more cases, more rulings, and possibly more involvement from higher courts. And every new decision adds another layer to how the law is understood. So what does this mean for you? It means awareness matters. It means understanding the law is not optional. And it means recognizing that legal rights come with legal responsibilities. Before we close, I want to bring you back to something important. This isn't just about California. It's not just about one law. It's about how constitutional rights are interpreted, protected, and challenged across the entire country. And whether you agree with the court's decision or not, one thing is clear. These rulings shape the reality people live under every single day. Now here's where things start to go even deeper. Because what most headlines don't explain is why courts are increasingly striking down laws like this, and what standard they are actually using behind the scenes. To understand that, you have to step into how constitutional analysis has evolved over time. For years, courts relied on what's known as a means-end scrutiny approach. In simple terms, they would ask, does this law serve an important government purpose, and is it reasonably connected to achieving that goal? If the answer was yes, the law often survived. But that framework has shifted, especially after the Supreme Court's decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. That case fundamentally changed how courts evaluate Second Amendment challenges. Instead of balancing interests, courts are now directed to look at history and tradition. The question is no longer just whether a law seems reasonable today. The question is whether a similar type of restriction existed when the Second Amendment was originally understood. In my legal analysis, this is one of the most consequential shifts in modern constitutional law. Because once you anchor interpretation in historical analogs, many contemporary regulations face a difficult test. Governments must now point to historical examples that closely resemble the modern law they are trying to defend. And that's not always easy. Courts would likely examine records from the 18th and 19th centuries, looking for laws that imposed comparable restrictions. If those historical parallels don't exist, the modern law may be considered inconsistent with the Constitution. This is exactly the kind of reasoning that has been applied in recent federal court decisions involving California. Now, it's important to understand something clearly. This does not automatically mean every gun regulation is unconstitutional. Courts have acknowledged that certain long-standing restrictions, like those involving sensitive places or specific categories of individuals, can still be valid. But the burden has shifted. The government now has to justify its law using historical evidence, not just policy arguments. And that creates a very different legal battlefield. Supporters of stricter gun laws argue that this approach is too rigid. They believe it limits the government's ability to respond to modern challenges, including technological changes and evolving public safety concerns. They might say, how can laws from centuries ago adequately guide decisions about issues that didn't even exist back then? And that's a fair question. On the other hand, critics of broad regulation argue that constitutional rights were never meant to expand or contract based on changing opinions. They believe the historical approach provides a stable and predictable standard. There is a strong constitutional argument that anchoring rights in history prevents them from being reshaped by temporary political pressures. So again, you see the tension. Now let's connect this back to California specifically. California has often been at the forefront of firearm regulation. Laws passed there frequently push the boundaries of what courts have previously allowed. That's one reason why so many legal challenges originate in that state. When a federal court reviews one of these laws, it's not just deciding a local issue. It's potentially setting a precedent that other courts may follow. And that brings us to another critical layer, the role of appellate courts. When a federal district court makes a ruling, it can be appealed. In California's case, That usually means review by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit has historically taken a different approach to some constitutional questions compared to other circuits. But even that court is now required to apply the framework established by the Supreme Court. So what you often see is an ongoing legal back and forth. A law is passed, it's challenged, a lower court blocks it, an appellate court reviews it, and sometimes the issue keeps moving up the ladder. Eventually, cases like this can reach the Supreme Court again, especially if different circuits issue conflicting decisions. And when that happens, the outcome can reshape the law nationwide. Now let's talk about something many people overlook: the potential Fourth and Fifth Amendment implications. At first glance, this might seem like purely a Second Amendment issue, but depending on how a law is structured and enforced, other constitutional protections can come into play. For example, if a regulation involves inspections, searches, or seizures, courts would likely examine whether it raises concerns under the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Similarly, if compliance with a law requires individuals to provide information that could be used against them, there could be Fifth Amendment considerations related to self-incrimination. In my legal analysis, these secondary constitutional issues are often under-discussed, but can be extremely important in litigation, because sometimes a law isn't challenged just on one ground, but on multiple constitutional fronts at the same time. Now let's bring this down to a practical level again. What should a lawful gun owner take away from all of this? First, understand that a court ruling does not always mean immediate clarity. Sometimes enforcement is paused. Sometimes it's reinstated later. Sometimes it varies depending on jurisdiction. This creates a situation where staying updated is not just helpful, it's necessary. Second, compliance remains critical at all times. Even if a law is being challenged or has been temporarily blocked, acting outside clearly established legal boundaries can carry serious consequences. There is no shortcut around that reality. Third, documentation and awareness matter more than ever. Understanding current requirements, keeping records where appropriate, and following official guidance can help reduce risk in a rapidly changing legal environment. Now let's zoom out again to the political reality. Regardless of court rulings, legislative efforts are likely to continue. States that favor stricter regulations will keep trying to craft laws that can survive constitutional scrutiny under the new framework. At the same time, advocacy groups and legal organizations will continue challenging those laws. So what we are seeing is not a final resolution, but an ongoing cycle. And each new case adds more clarity, but also more complexity. Because as courts refine the standards, lawmakers adjust their strategies, and the process repeats. In my legal analysis, this dynamic ensures that the issue remains active for years to come. Now think about the long-term implications. If courts consistently apply a strict historical standard, we may see a narrowing of what types of regulations are considered permissible. But if courts begin to interpret historical analogs more broadly, there could still be room for modern regulations to survive. That balance has not been fully settled yet. And that uncertainty is exactly why these cases matter so much. Because they are not just about one law, they are about defining the boundaries of constitutional rights in a modern society. As we move forward, the role of the Supreme Court will remain central. Every time it takes up a case in this area, it provides additional guidance that lower courts are required to follow. And with each decision, the legal landscape becomes a little more defined, but never completely settled. So as you continue following stories like this, remember what's really at stake. It's not just policy, it's not just politics. It's the interpretation of constitutional rights that affect millions of people. And those interpretations can shift, not randomly, but through a structured legal process that continues to evolve. Stay engaged, stay informed, and keep approaching this topic with the seriousness it deserves. Because understanding the law is not just about knowledge. It's about responsibility in a system where the rules can change, but the consequences remain very real. And now, as this continues to unfold, there's one more layer that often doesn't get enough attention. And that's how uncertainty itself becomes part of the legal risk. Because when laws are being challenged, blocked, reinstated, or modified through court orders, the situation on the ground doesn't always move in a straight line. One ruling comes out. Then it's appealed. Another court weighs in. Sometimes enforcement is paused. Sometimes it resumes. And for the average lawful gun owner, it can feel like the rules are shifting beneath your feet. In my legal analysis, this period of uncertainty is where people are most vulnerable, not because they intend to break the law, but because the law itself is in flux. Courts would likely recognize that clarity is essential for compliance. But the reality is, the judicial process takes time, and during that time, individuals are still expected to follow whatever the current enforceable standard is. That's why relying on outdated information, assumptions, or secondhand interpretations can be risky. And this brings us to enforcement. Even when a law is challenged, enforcement agencies may still operate based on existing guidance until a final ruling is issued. That means what you read in a headline may not immediately reflect what is being applied in practice. There is a strong constitutional argument that laws must be clear and predictable so individuals can regulate their conduct accordingly. But in periods like this, that clarity can be limited. So what do courts do in response? They try to issue precise rulings, sometimes narrowing their decisions to specific provisions rather than striking down an entire law. Other times, they may allow certain parts to remain while blocking others. This creates a patchwork effect, and that patchwork is exactly why understanding the details matters more than ever. Now let's consider something broader: the long-term direction of constitutional interpretation. If the current trajectory continues, we may see courts increasingly rely on historical benchmarks when evaluating not just gun laws, but potentially other constitutional questions as well. That could influence how future rights are interpreted across different areas of law. But at the same time, courts are also aware that society evolves, technology changes, risks change, public expectations change. So the challenge becomes finding a balance between constitutional consistency and modern reality. In my legal analysis, that balance is still being defined in real time, and cases like this are part of that process. Now, from a policy perspective, lawmakers are not likely to stop introducing new regulations. Instead, they may begin drafting laws more carefully, anticipating constitutional challenges from the very beginning. They may look for historical parallels before passing legislation. They may narrow the scope of restrictions. They may adjust enforcement mechanisms. All of this is part of an adaptive legal system. On the other side, legal challenges will continue to play a critical role. Advocacy groups, legal scholars, and individuals will keep testing these laws in court, ensuring that constitutional boundaries are constantly examined. This back and forth is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Now let's bring this back to you, the viewer. Because at the end of the day, all of this legal complexity comes down to one simple reality: your responsibility to understand and follow the law as it exists right now. Not as it was last year, not as it might be in the future, but as it stands today. That means staying updated through reliable sources. That means being cautious when laws are in transition. And that means recognizing that even unintentional mistakes can have serious legal consequences. This is not about fear. It's about awareness. It's about understanding that rights and responsibilities go hand in hand. And it's about approaching both with the seriousness they deserve. As we continue to see more rulings, more challenges, and possibly more involvement from higher courts, one thing is certain: this conversation is far from over. And every new development adds another piece to a much larger legal picture. So don't just watch headlines. Understand them, question them, engage with them, and always approach them with a mindset grounded in law, not assumption. If this breakdown helped you see beyond the surface and actually understand what's happening, then make sure you stay connected. Subscribe to the channel, press the bell icon so you don't miss the next update, and be part of a community that values clear, responsible, and informed discussion. And before you go, I want to hear from you. What topic should we break down next? Drop your suggestion in the comments, because the next video might be based on your question. And remember this: in a world where laws can shift through a single court decision, staying informed isn't optional, it's essential.